Great to see you men again. And I trust everyone is healthy in your family and your churches. These are still challenging times for us. I'm this Sunday going to be preaching the book of Ruth. I've tried to preach the whole book as a whole, but just focusing on the message there of God's providence. And you guys last module that studied that story and just how God brought about difficult circumstances, but then also used them for great blessing as well. And so we know our God has a plan. We know that He's in control. We know that He's wise. We know that He's good. And so we just need to keep encouraging our people in those truths about God, because it can be difficult for some in these kinds of situations. So I'm sure that you're doing that with those in your congregations, and just want to encourage you men too, that just to remind ourselves that even what we're studying about the Lord in Psalm 99, that His mercy is also part of His holiness, that a great God such as He, what God could be like Him, that has all this power and majesty and at the same time cares for His creation like He does. And so we have put our confidence in Him and trust Him. And that's one of the reasons I chose this psalm just for our study. I think it's really a helpful psalm to commit to memory, and a helpful one that hopefully when we're done studying it together that you will take and preach from to your congregations as well. So with that, let me open up our notes and focus our attention on poetic analysis that we've been doing and will continue to do today, as we have done. Again, I'm just going to continually remind you of these initial steps in poetic analysis: to read and observe the poem, then to identify its setting and structure, to examine its parallelism, and then, as we've been doing the last few weeks, to identify the imagery and the poetic devices used in the poem. And just to remind you that those three components or steps within this fourth step is to, one, identify the images of the poem, and we've done that for Psalm 99. Remember, it's an enthronement psalm, and verse 1 focuses on the reign and power and rule of God over all creation, and then verses 2 through 9 draw attention to God being exalted among His people, particularly as they come to worship in the temple. And then the second step we are doing, and that's where we're finding ourselves this morning again, is to identify the figurative language. And I know we spent a lot of time on that. We've been doing it. We spent all last week and a good portion of the week before that. And I want to do that because figurative language is such a critical piece to studying poetry. I mean, it makes it really, all poetry has figurative language. Much poetry has parallelism, but not all poetry has parallelism. Much poetry has terseness or shortness in the verses, but not all poetry. But all poetry and Hebrew poetry has figurative language, figures of speech that are used, poetic devices. And so that's why we've been spending a good amount of time on this part. All right. And so, Lord willing, today we'll be done with that so we can move on to the next steps. But we'll see where the Lord takes us. And again, just want to encourage you, if you guys have any questions, comments, or any questions even outside of what we're covering here this morning, please feel free to just ask, all right, and get my attention. Okay, so with that, the last step then, after we've completed the imagery and poetic devices, is to take all that information that we've obtained so far from our reading and observations, from identifying the setting of the poem and the structure, from examining the parallelism, and from identifying the images and the poetic devices. We take all of that from those 4 steps in poetic analysis and summarize them in identifying the theme of the poem and also the theme of each stanza in the poem. And we'll do that once we've completed this last step of the imagery. And as I already mentioned, we've seen this several times from the Psalm, two major images here, both of which focus on the greatness, the power, the sovereignty of God over creation and then over his people. And the reason for that is because of his holiness, because of his otherness, his greatness, all right? That he's worthy of our humble worship. And then last couple of weeks, we focused our attention on the figures of speech and this second step of identifying figurative language. You'll remember all of these, right? We had the figures of speech of comparison, simile, metaphor, hypocatastasis, hyperbole, attributing features such as personification, anthropomorphism, zoomorphism, substitution, which was metonymy, synecdoche, those fancy words, and then apostrophe, that's direct address, and then irony, wordplay, merism, interjection, idiom, and rhetorical question. And as I said before, there are a number of other poetic devices that you'll find if you type in the internet, poetic devices or figures of speech. I mean, you'll find 2 or 3 times this number, but I chose those devices, those figures of speech that we will typically see in poetry, all right? Because if the list is too big, if we have 50 figures of speech that we're trying to look for, it becomes too difficult. We really would get bogged down in analysis. So I think this list is captures most of what figures of speech we will see, all right? And so we went through, I don't know how many examples last week, and hopefully that was helpful to you guys to just look at different types of figures of speech. And so I really wanted to spend time on that, again, because of the importance. And so what I'd like to do this morning to sort of begin our study is now with this list here of the figures of speech, and then I'll just show you, here's all of them together that we've looked at. With this list, we will apply it to studying Psalm 99. And what I'd like to do is we'll read through the Psalm together and then come back, and I'll just call on each one of you to look at a particular verse and see if you can identify the figures of speech used in that verse. Now, I'll tell you now that a couple of verses may not have any obvious figures of speech. So if you're given a verse and you just can't see anything, that it may be because there isn't any obvious ones there. So I'll just give you that heads up right now. Okay, but let's go to reading the Psalm together. And I'll ask again if some brothers can help. Maybe read 3 verses each. Salito, let me ask you to read verses 1 through 3. Ramel, if you could read 4 through 6. And then Kent, if you could read 7 through 9.
Okay, Pastor. Okay.
Thank you. Brother Salito?
Yes. The Lord reigns. Let the peoples tremble. He is enthroned above the cherubim. Let the earth shake. The Lord is great in Zion, and he is exalted above all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he.
The strength of the king loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Holy is he. Moses and Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called upon the Lord, and he answered them.
He spoke to them in the pillar of cloud. They kept his testimonies and the statute that he gave them. O Lord our God, you answered them. You were a forgiving God to them, and yet an avenger of their evil deeds. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy hill, for holy is the Lord our God.
All right, very good. Okay, let's go back to verse 1. And I'll start with our birthday boy, Brother Ruel. If you could see if you can identify any figures of speech in verse 1. You see any there?
He's blowing his cake.
You're on mute still there. See anything, Ruel?
He can't hear us.
Oh, you're on mute, brother. Yeah, there you go.
All right.
See anything?
Yeah, one is the earth shake.
Okay, what is that?
I think this is what we call this.
Apostrophe. Idiom.
What is that?
Hyperbolic.
Let the earth shake. What does that sound like?
It's attributing.
Yes.
Good morning.
right.
Sorry I'm late.
Good morning, Will. It's
Good
attributing. Hi, Edwin.
Hello. Morning.
Ruel, you're on the right track there. It's attributing. What were some of the?
I'm sorry, my
It's saying let the earth
my
shake.
connection is choppy.
Okay. Anyone want to help out? What do you guys see here?
Pastor Tim, how about apostrophe?
Apostrophe.
Lord reigns.
Apostrophe. Again, it would be something more of addressing the Lord, like if it said, "Oh Lord," or "Oh my Lord." That would be apostrophe. But here he just makes a declaration: "The Lord reigns." So it wouldn't be apostrophe here. But "let the earth shake" is a figure of speech.
That is personification.
Yes, there you go.
Personification. Right?
Yeah, he's telling the earth to do something that, like a person. And another personification or type of personification is "let the peoples tremble." Now, people are here, but he's speaking of like a group, like nations. So he's saying collectively or all together, let the nations tremble. So it's sort of like a personification of this idea of nations. All right, that's a little more subtle there. But you guys see any other types of poetic device here? There's
Pastor Tim.
Yeah.
Could the word "let the people tremble" could this be also called as metonymy?
In what way?
Representing the entire or the entire population
Human
of the
race.
earth,
like
the
that.
entire human race. People's representing the entire human race.
Normally, yeah, that's a good question.
I am also thinking of the "let the earth shake" as an idiom referring holiness and awe.
Could be idiom for earth, earthquake,
earth
right?
shake.
Could be an idiom for earthquake. I think personification more fits, given that's what's typical in poetry. We're telling an inanimate object to do something that a person would do. But I don't know. It could be an idiom that's being used here. Let me shorten this a little bit. Now in metonymy, normally you have a different kind of noun representing another noun. So because these are close together, peoples, nations are made up of peoples, all humans can be described as peoples. I don't know that I would refer to this as a metonymy. Now, if it had said something like, talking about the trees as representing people or something like that, then that would be a metonymy. But I don't think I don't think we have that here. I think personification is being used. There's one other device that I see. We haven't talked about it yet. Yeah. What's that?
Cherubim, Pastor.
I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Above the cherubim.
Is what? What kind of device?
I think this is also either synecdoche or metonymy representing the temple or the Ark of the Covenant.
Oh yeah. It could be. Well, I think he's speaking literally of the cherubim, you know, in the temple. So I don't think he's saying the cherubim represent the temple. But later we're going to see that when he talks about his footstool. I think that will be an example of metonymy in another verse. Here, I think he is actually describing the Ark of the Covenant, where the cherubim are on top of the Ark. And so he's referring location-wise to the temple, but here I don't think the cherubim represents the temple. It's just an object within the temple, a picture that he's describing here. But that's a good observation. One other thing that we're going to notice in several of these verses, it's another poetic
Repetition.
device that we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to talk about a little later. But we're going to see that within the verse, because notice the words reigns, enthroned, above. Okay. So keep an eye for repetition within a verse as we go through these rest of these verses. Okay. All right. That was a little bit of a tough one there. Let's try verse 2. Narelle, you want to take a look at verse 2. What do you see there as far as figures of speech? Anything stick out?
As what you have said, Pastor Tim, people's personification.
Okay, the peoples maybe. Yeah,
That referring for a
but
group
what does he tell the peoples to do though here? He's not telling them to do anything. He's just saying God is exalted above them. So he's not telling the peoples to do something.
The Lord is great in Zion.
Metaphor.
Zion.
Zion.
The Zion.
Pastor Tim, how about the Lord
Synecdoche.
in Zion? Metaphor.
Metaphor?
Yeah. The Lord, because of the word is. The catching word is.
Okay. Now, if he had said the Lord is Zion, that would be a metaphor. But what he's saying is something about the Lord in Zion. So I wouldn't see a metaphor here.
Synecdoche, Pastor Tim, Zion representing Jerusalem.
Okay, that's a possibility.
Yes.
Okay, good. I can never spell this right. Synecdoche.
Synecdoche.
Zion representing either
Jerusalem
Jerusalem or the temple. Okay, it's used of both. And here, as we're looking through the whole psalm, what would you say it's likely referring to? The temple or Jerusalem? Temple. Right?
Temple.
He speaks of the temple when he talks about his footstool here in verse 5.
Oh, okay.
He speaks of the temple here in verse 9.
Yes.
Okay, so it's likely here that Zion is representing either Jerusalem or representing the temple.
Temple.
Okay.
All people's hyperbole.
Maybe hyperbole. Yeah.
Because of the direct address, the Lord is great in Zion.
Say again. The Lord is great in Zion.
And that be apostrophe. Direct address, the Lord is great in Zion.
apostrophe again would be
Oh
the
Lord,
key here is
you are great.
direct address.
You are great.
Okay.
The Lord great.
All right. So it's not that apostrophe is not the situation when something is said about God. Apostrophe would be if God is directly addressed. So again, if it had said, if he had said something like, "Oh Lord, you are great in Zion," then "Oh Lord" would be a apostrophe. Or if he had said, "Oh people, God is exalted above you." All right. If he had said something like, "Oh peoples, God is exalted above you," then "oh peoples" would be apostrophe. It's whenever the poet is directly speaking to a person or a group of people or a thing. Okay? So in this case, verse 2, he's not speaking directly to the Lord. He's just saying something about the Lord. Okay? Does that make sense? So apostrophe, think of that word "oh," okay? Because you're typically going to see "oh" in the address. "Oh Lord, oh my soul, oh God, oh peoples, oh King."
Yes.
That's very commonly what you will see in the poetry with direct address, with apostrophe, I mean. So hyperbole, all peoples, it could be, but I really think here, right, he is speaking about all the earth. I don't think it's an exaggeration. So I would just put a question mark there. Notice too, do you see repetition again?
Great.
No.
Yes,
Exalted.
great, exalted,
Great and exalted.
great and exalted, exalted above.
Okay.
And then you should notice there's some repetition with verse 1 there, right? We'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay. So good. Synecdoche and repetition. Hyperbole, I would tend to probably not see that in this verse. Okay. All right. Because again, hyperbole refers to an exaggeration. So just because the word "all" is there doesn't mean that he's exaggerating. It doesn't mean that he is not referring to all the earth or all the nations. Okay. But you might see it more in things like, everyone is against me, or God has never shown himself to me, or things that really aren't fully true. They're just an exaggeration. But in this case, in verse 2, I don't think he's exaggerating. It is a true statement, right? Is God exalted over all the nations? Is that true?
Yes.
It is, right? So I don't think it's an exaggeration here. All right.
There are also peoples, Pastor Tim, that tramples practically the name of the Lord.
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
There are also peoples that practically tramples the name of the Lord.
Yes, but God is still exalted over them, right? He's still greater than all peoples, whether they worship him or not. It's still a true statement. So, but the goal of this psalm, the goal of Scripture, is that everyone would come to submit themselves to the Lord. Okay, verse 3. Let's see. Brother Eric, do you want to take a look? See if you see anything in verse 3, any figurative language?
Let the people praise you. Praise your great.
You see anything?
Praise your great awesome name. Holy is he.
Yeah, any figurative language, figures of speech here that you can see?
Personification.
Okay, what would the personification be?
Praise your name. An awesome name.
What's that, Eric?
Holy is he.
Let them praise. Let them praise your great.
Okay.
Metaphor. Holy is he. Metaphor.
Metaphor.
Holy is he.
Well, again, a metaphor. What would the metaphor be here? Because he is holy is a true statement, right? It's not a comparison. Remember, metaphor is a comparison. When you compare one thing to another, just because the word is here doesn't automatically mean metaphor. Now, if it had said, you know, if he had said, you know, a shepherd is he, that's a metaphor. All right. But if you were to say, you know, he is love, or he is good, or he is holy, those aren't metaphors. Those are just true descriptions of God's character. Okay. Let me ask you. I see a figure of speech with.
How about
Also then,
Okay.
apostrophe.
some name?
Praise your great.
Name.
Yeah, name is a figure of speech here. What kind?
Synecdoche.
Okay.
Synecdoche to represent God. The whole.
Yeah, it represents God, right? And we would call this a metonymy.
Represent the Lord. Yeah.
Metonymy.
Metonymy.
Okay.
Metonymy.
Again, metonymy is when one thing represents another. Now, okay, synecdoche is when one part of something represents the whole. So I guess maybe name, we could see name that way, huh? Because it is part of him. So that might be a better way to look at it. I could see that.
Yeah.
All right, synecdoche. All right. Because we're not praising his name. It's not like we're saying, "Oh Yahweh, praise Yahweh's name," like we're seeing something great about those letters Yahweh, but we're praising him, right? It means praise Yahweh himself, not letters of his name. So that's just an expression, right? A synecdoche of where his name represents the whole God, all of God. Okay, so synecdoche again is part of something that is representing the whole thing. Like if I were to, you know, say the voice said to me. Well, it wasn't a voice that spoke; it was a person who spoke.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that his voice sort of as representing the whole person. Okay, and so here synecdoche would be the name. The name represents the whole person of God, not just what he calls himself. Does that make sense?
Pastor Tim, how about great and awesome repetition?
Great and awesome. What would that be? What kind of?
Repetition.
Okay, good. Very good. Yeah, repetition.
Yeah, repetition. Holy is he.
Great and awesome. And yeah, we could maybe say even holy. Those are all sort of related, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right.
The phrase, let them praise your name, your great and awesome name, Pastor Tim. Could this be an apostrophe because God is addressed here?
Well, again, remember, apostrophe is going to have, is likely going to have an O.
Okay,
right?
Okay. Thank you.
So keep that in mind. So if we see, oh, all you people, praise his great and awesome name, or something like that, that's apostrophe. So again, just think of it like
strong emotion.
Strong emotion, but there's a direct statement of the person he's speaking to. Here he is he's saying, let them praise your great and awesome name. Now, if he had identified the them directly by saying, oh, all peoples, praise his great and awesome name, that would be apostrophe. But again, here he's not directly addressing somebody personally, but he's just giving a general command. Okay? All right, let's try verse 4, and we'll see. Macdon, if you want to, why don't you take a look at this, see what you see.
Strength of the king, love justice. You have iniquity, you have established.
Anything stick out to you?
Repetition.
The word king.
King?
Yeah.
Personification. What do you see as
God.
personification there?
Represents God.
Let's let Eric answer, or Macdon answer first, and then we'll. Personification where?
Strength.
Yeah, I think so. That's kind of an inanimate object, right? The strength of the king, and then he says loves. Now, if he had said the king loves, that's not personification, because the king is a person, right? But here he says the strength of the king loves. So it's a quality of the king that's being said to love something. So the way that's worded, I would say I would agree, Macdon, that's personification. Okay, I heard somebody mention repetition. Do we see repetition here?
Justice and justice, righteousness.
Equity, justice again.
Justice,
Righteousness. Yeah, a lot of repetition here. Okay, good.
Jacob.
Okay, very good. Who said that? That's a good one.
That's
Narelle?
Jacob, yes.
Yeah, okay, you get bonus points for today. Special credit.
You can go home now.
Okay, what is Jacob? What kind of figure of speech is that?
Israel.
Can you tell me?
Yeah, it equals Israel, right?
Yes.
And yeah, it'd be synecdoche, right? Because Jacob is a part of Israel, right? He's the first, he's the father of Israel, but he's still part of Israel. So I would see it as synecdoche, that Jacob here representing Israel, because he's not just saying Jacob, that justice and righteousness only happen in Jacob, just the one man Jacob, right? He's speaking of Israel. All right, so excellent, very good. All right,
Certain. How about the strength? It's not a representative of the king also.
Entity.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And in fact, this actually, if we were to do a word study there of that phrase, it's actually very difficult to translate. You'll see in the different translations, it's treated differently. For example, let me see. In the ESV, it says, the king in his might loves justice. The New King James says, the king's strength loves justice. The NIV says, the king is mighty, he loves justice. So that's actually a complicated translation that we're going to have to tackle when we do our word studies later. So
but it seems that the strength is just part of the king, right? Part of the attributes of the king.
Yeah, it's one attribute of the king. And now when it says the strength of the king loves justice, that's a personification. But I don't know if just the word strength has any figure of speech connected to it. Did you have one in mind that you thought of?
It seems like synecdoche.
That it represents the king?
Yeah.
Possibly. We can put it down as a possibility. But again, I put question marks. Not sure on that one. Okay. Good. Let's get to verse 5. Verse 5. Let's see. Jesse, why don't you try that one? Verse 5.
Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Holy is he. The first thing that I see here is repetition, Pastor Tim. Exalt and worship.
Okay, repetition again. Exalt, worship. Okay, good.
Worship.
What else?
Lord our God.
Footstool,
Footstool.
temple, metonymy.
Okay, metonymy. What is the metonymy?
Footstool.
Footstool, Pastor Tim.
Yeah,
Metonymy.
Yeah,
Okay.
footstool, right? It's not a literal footstool that he's talking about here, is it? It's a reference to the temple.
The temple.
Now, we don't say this is synecdoche. Why?
Because footstool is not part of the temple.
Okay, good. Now, what if he had said altar? Worship at his altar.
That's
Part of the temple.
part of the
Then, yeah, then it would be synecdoche, right? If he means by altar all the temple. Okay? So the difference is, though, here footstool is not any part of the temple. It's sort of a picture of God, you know, where his feet rest. And so there are a couple other passages where footstool is used in reference to the temple.
With him, it's not us, the earth.
Yeah, there is a passage, Isaiah 66.
The earth is your footstool.
It says, heavens are your throne and the earth is his footstool. So it could, footstool could be the earth, but if we notice, notice verse 9, okay? Verse 9 is the exact same phrase. It's a refrain.
Yes. Holy hill.
And what does it say here? Exactly, holy hill.
Holy hill.
So if you compare it, holy hill
Footstool.
and footstool. All right, you see that footstool? Holy hill. That's the only difference. If I can highlight it here for you. All right, you see this? It's exactly the same, almost exactly the same. Exalt the Lord our God, worship at his footstool. Then verse 9, exalt the Lord our God, worship at his holy hill.
Okay.
All right, so, and we know holy hill is a reference to the temple.
Temple.
All right, so if we didn't have verse 9, then it would be a little bit harder to determine what is meant by footstool. I think another clue that footstool is a reference to the temple is if we go back up to verse 1, I'm sorry.
Also the word worship, Pastor Tim.
Where it says cherubim. Yeah, and worship on the earth, that's kind of an unusual phrase. Normally we wouldn't have that.
During this time, they can also only worship the Lord in the temple.
Yeah, so that would make more sense theologically, but I think the bigger the bigger reason is the parallel idea given in verse 9. Okay, very good question though.
Okay.
Okay, could be the earth. I'll even put, I think it's Isaiah, if I remember right, 66:2. But again, notice verse 9 says holy hill. Okay, any other figures of speech that you see in
Worship.
Yeah, actually that word worship, it literally means bow down. So literally saying bow down at his footstool, but it's interpreted, the idea is worship. So we might even describe this as an idiom. Okay, but put question mark there, because the word literally for worship isn't worship. It's literally bow down or prostrate yourself, but it carries the idea of a worship being offered to God. And so it's a word that's sort of become an idiom, I think, in the Hebrew poetry for worship. And because of that, we also might have an irony here. Notice the word exalt, that equals lift up, but
Oh
then
yeah.
it contrasts with worship,
Yeah.
which
Bow down.
is bow down. Now, you might not pick this up at this step. It might not be something that you would see until you did a word study. So we're sort of cheating here. But this is actually something, when I did my first study on this, I didn't notice that until I did a word study later and said, oh, that's interesting. So exalt is literally the word to lift something up. And worship is literally the word to bow something down. And so,
Irony.
yeah, I think there's almost like an irony there. How do we lift God up? By bowing ourselves down. Okay? So, I think that's a very interesting picture that's being given. Okay, so a lot here. I know a few of these may not have been obvious.
Yeah.
But that's why we're going through this. I just want, we got to practice. It's like anything, guys, if you're not used to doing this, it's like learning a new language or learning a new skill. You have to do it a lot, and then you get better at it, and you can see things more clearly. So if you're not seeing a lot of these, don't worry or feel like you're not understanding or getting it. That's normal. When I took poetry, I was completely lost. And English is my first language, and I still couldn't see any of these things. But with practice and study, and I still don't see. I'm catching some tonight that I hadn't seen before. You guys have caught some things that I hadn't really thought about or noticed. So it's a learning over time. So don't get discouraged or feel like if you're not seeing these things, don't give up. Okay, we're just going through them together, so I can kind of show you, and we can show each other these different figures of speech, and you'll get a better feel for it as you do this more. Excuse me.
Actually, Pastor Tim, this study is a great help to me. And with this, I would like to say thank you for the effort that
Praise
you
the
put
Lord.
in this study.
Praise the Lord. When I was in seminary, I had one class from Professor Dr. Barrick, and he taught one class on the Psalms, how to preach the Psalms. It was probably one of the most helpful classes I took in seminary, because I had no idea like what to do with poetry. So I was afraid to preach poems, or when I preached poems, they came out like an epistle, where it was like just a doctrinal message, which is fine, but I didn't really reflect the emotion or the intensity or the feelings that were coming out of the poem, because I couldn't understand any of the figurative language that was being used or the parallelism or those things. And so Dr. Barrick really helped me in getting a better picture of these Psalms. And in your syllabus, I don't know if you noticed, but there's a website here. Let me just give it to you right now again, in case, called drbarrick.org. Highly recommend it for a few reasons. In fact, let's just take a moment, jump out of our notes, because I want to show some things from this website to you. I think you will find it a very useful tool. Okay, so let me open up. Hopefully I can open up, and I'll show you a couple things from it that I think you'll find helpful. Okay, good. So let me go over and share this. Okay, so there he is. There's a picture of him. He's was my Hebrew professor, and he, he was one of my, I had two of my favorite professors in seminary. Dr. Barrick was one of them, and then also Professor Montoya, Alex Montoya was the other. He was the preaching professor, and he really helped me too with preaching. Dr. Barrick also helped with preaching, but more so with just how to study, particularly Hebrew, and like I said, especially on Hebrew poetry. So if you go to his website, this is what you'll see. And if you go to teaching, hopefully you guys can see this. I'll expand it a little. And notice under teaching, he's got several books. One of them, he wrote by the way, he wrote a commentary on Ecclesiastes. But notice here he's got the Psalms. And if I open that up, he has an introduction to the Psalms where he has, he taught through all of the Psalms in his Sunday school class at church. And so he's got an introduction to the Psalms, and then which he did in 3 parts, and then the books of the Psalms. And then if we, let's open up Psalm 99, which would be in book 2. I got to go back. I'll just show you some of the things you can get here. Now you can listen to all right, Psalm. So if you can see what I'm doing here, I'm going to Psalm 99, the notes. And he's got this for every single psalm. And what he does is, again, this was something he offered in his Sunday school class, so it won't be a lot of exegetical detail, but he's got some great insights. All right, can everybody see this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so what he does is he'll do an introduction, some general comments about the Psalms. And notice this one too, by the way. I hadn't seen this till I looked at his notes. There's 3 times that the psalm mentions exalt, 3 times that the psalm mentions holy is he. And think about that. There's 2 passages in the Bible that describe the throne room of heaven. Isaiah 6 and Revelation chapter 4. And do you remember what is being declared over and over again in the throne room? Holy, holy, holy,
Holy.
is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. How many times is the word holy repeated?
3 times.
3 times. How many times is holy is he repeated in Psalm 99?
3 times.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
So anyway, that's something I mean, it's obvious when you think about it, but I hadn't thought about it until I read this statement from Dr. Barrick. Think, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder if that was intentional to connect to those 2 passages. So he'll offer some general insights. He called it a theocratic psalm. It's the same as an enthronement psalm. Then he'll break down the psalm, and notice he puts how many lines per verse, so you can kind of see what he did with that. Okay, and then he'll give his outline. All right, which can be very helpful. And then he'll have little comments on each verse. And again, he doesn't address everything, but he just highlights certain things as he goes through. All right, and he'll come up with some insights. We're not going to look at everything. I just want to just expose you to the kinds of things you'll see there. And then here, by the way, I remember I mentioned verse 4 as having some different translations. So notice he talks about that here. And he gives some of the different translations here. And if you listen to his audio version, he'll give you more detail of what he actually taught in the class. Okay, and so then he goes through, gives some notes. Oh, here's the discussion of footstool. Ark of the Covenant is called God's footstool. Worship at God's footstool reflects a common ancient Near Eastern practice of bowing at the feet of a king on his throne. That's a helpful insight. He talks about Moses and Aaron. And then what he does, so he goes through all the verses, he'll give some comments, and then he actually identifies a song that's connected to the theme of the psalm here, which is kind of a helpful thing if you're preaching and you want to sing something in response to the psalm. So he identifies a couple of songs here regarding that, and then even just a prayer, how to pray through the psalm and how to apply the psalm. Okay? So helpful resource. This is just a few pages. It's not like a full commentary, but Dr. Barrick is very well studied. Like I said, he's a guy I would recommend probably more than anyone else for the Psalms to study. And what you can do is, whoops, sorry about that. Let me go back to here. And if you want, if you see, can you see where I'm pressing audio?
Yes.
This will give you, you can listen to him for a minute. Did you guys hear that?
Yeah.
No? Okay. I'm not sure if it'll go through. But you can listen to his Sunday school lesson and he'll explain, you'll get more detail there. So that's one thing, helpful resource from this website. Let me show you a couple other things while we're here. So again, this has all the Psalms. So you'll get some helpful things there. And notice, like I said, if you're studying Leviticus, he's got a lot of resources here on, or Ecclesiastes, I'm sorry. Ecclesiastes, notice, he's taught through the entire book. He'll have notes. He has, again, his messages. And he really understands Hebrew. He will definitely be a helpful resource. If you're studying Ecclesiastes, if you're studying Psalms, if you're studying Leviticus and Revelation. And then one other thing I wanted to show you, there's a lot here that you can explore, but one other thing that he does, for those of you who are interested in learning Hebrew, all right? Right, we're still in lockdown, so you have all kinds of time, right? You can learn different languages, all right? So if you're interested in just getting some exposure to Hebrew, Dr. Barrick is very smart, but he's also a good teacher. And he makes difficult things, easier to understand. And what you can do here is, I'm trying to find, he's got several courses, Introduction to Hebrew. These are video classes, Hebrew 2, Hebrew exegesis, and then he's got a couple others, Old Testament Introduction to Genesis. And these are video lectures that he gave in seminary, and all you need to do is just sign up. It's a free series. You can sign up just by creating an account there. And he has, trying to find it, the book I use for Hebrew grammar. Let me see if he has it here. These are books that he's written or contributed to. Let me see. Grammar.
Wow. Wow.
Okay, here we are. This is a full textbook, biblical Hebrew, and one that I found is the easiest to go through if you want to learn Hebrew. And if you use this book along with his lectures, this is over 200 pages, all right? And it's the textbook we used in seminary. This is the basic Hebrew textbook. But what's really helpful about how they did this, if I could scroll to the table of contents. Here we are. Is the way they approached it was very in bite sizes. So they just went kind of very slowly took one specific aspect and just walk you through basic Hebrew. Okay, so this is a textbook you can download for free at drbarrick.org. You can see the.
How about Greek, Pastor Kim? We had also
Greek. Well, Greek would be a little difficult for studying Hebrew poetry, but if you want to do Greek, that was a joke. Joke lang. So, Greek. There are some courses offered through Master's Seminary on YouTube that you could look up. I took one from Dr. Farnell that I think would be the best to study from. I'll take a look, and next week I'll see if I can show you some online resources for Greek. Okay, let me write a note to myself on that. But again, drbarrick.org. I think it's very, very helpful site. There's a lot of other things here. I didn't want to go through all now, but just wanted you to see that there's some really helpful tools and resources on this website for Hebrew and particularly Hebrew poetry. Okay. Remember we had the discussion about accents before? There's a chapter, he talks about accents here as well. Okay. Among other things. And then, so once you've gone through this and gone through his video lectures, I think you'll have a good start on just understanding the basics of Hebrew text. Okay, any questions or comments before we get back to Psalm 99?
We're just overwhelmed most of them.
I hope in a good way.
So inspiring.
So just, again, let me go back to the notes. I just wanted to expose that to you as a resource. And again, I noted it in your syllabus when we went through in class, but we covered a lot of stuff in class. So here it's on the, I typed it in here for you as well, drbarrick.org. So if you want to make note of that, it'll be in your notes that I post the next few days from our class tonight. All right. Great resource. Okay. Let's get back to, sure. You're welcome. All right. Verse 6. Verse 6, let's see. German, I think we're to you now.
Okay.
Do you see any figures of speech in verse 6?
Yeah. Moses, Aaron, and Samuel, substitution under the metonymy. They are pressed. Moses and Aaron and Samuel.
Okay.
Okay. Falls under metonymy.
Okay, who do they represent?
Rest. God's rest.
God's rest? Is that what you're saying?
God,
or priest?
Priest, yeah.
Yeah, so. Well, we have to ask ourselves something.
Isn't it literal?
A figure of speech, can keep this in mind. When we talk about figure of speech or figurative language, what we're saying here is that a particular word or group of words isn't meant literally. It's
apostrophe.
It's not. It's used in some other way other than literal. So if Moses and Aaron and Samuel here, we have to ask the question: is the poet referring to those actual men? Yes. Now up above, remember when we talked about Jacob up here in verse 4? Yeah. Jacob here, he wasn't speaking literally just about Jacob, right?
Because of the word in.
There he was, exactly. There he was referring to Israel. So we know here that Jacob is a figure of speech because we know that the reference here is not literally Jacob the man, but the people of Jacob, Israel. So when we go to verse 6, we have to ask, what you're doing in this step in figures of speech is you're looking for things that aren't meant literally. All right? So we have to ask, if Moses and Aaron and Samuel, are those being referred to literally? Is the poet really meaning the man Moses, the man Aaron, and the man Samuel? And what would you guys say? Do you think that's literal here?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's literal.
Yeah,
Literal.
I think they are literal. Now
So it's apostrophe.
they're described here. They're described here as God's priests, but it's still they're being referred to literally here. So
That's
I don't think
declaration.
so.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say that they are synecdoche or metonymy or anything like that because they don't represent something else. Okay.
Apostrophe.
Now apostrophe again. Do you see any?
Oh.
No.
We don't. Yeah. So
Oh
there's
no, we don't say any.
Oh. All right. So no apostrophe here.
I think synecdoche.
Okay, what would the synecdoche be?
His name.
Okay, synecdoche. Yeah, they call upon his name. Now, is he literally saying? Okay, again, here's where we would ask ourselves, figure of speech or figurative language, are those words or phrases that are not meant literally? So here, his name is the poet literally saying that Moses, Aaron, and Samuel would just call out Yahweh, 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 and that's all they did?
No.
No. He's saying called on his name is a reference to called on
upon the Lord.
Him, right? Equals the Lord. So here it is a figure of speech that his name is representing God himself. So it's a synecdoche. His name is part of God himself. Do you guys see that? So
Yeah.
Very good, Joel.
You're
Happy
looking
birthday.
for
Jason.
You're looking for words or phrases that are not intended to be literal. So if you see that, so for example, they called upon the Lord. Now, that's what is he describing there? That phrase.
Prayer or worship.
His prayer.
Yeah, that's prayer, right? So this is actually, I would say, an idiom. It's another way to describe prayer. Instead of saying prayed, he says they called upon the Lord. That was a common reference in the Old Testament to praying, calling upon, or prayer. So I would see that as an idiom here. Okay, and notice. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I see another one, but
yeah, go ahead. What do you see?
About the
He
last
answered.
anthropomorphism, he answered them.
Okay, he answered. Now, he answered them. Does that just means they said, "Oh Lord, we pray, ask you to help," and then does the he answered them mean God says,
"Okay,
I hear you, okay, hello," or does he answered them refer to something else?
Idiom dyan po.
Yeah, it's an idiom meaning
responded.
He responded. He answered in the sense of he did something. He
did something.
Met their prayer, or how would you say that? We say the term answered their prayer because actually we use the same kind of idiom. So it's not just the fact that he answered, but the answer is that he met the request. He fulfilled the request. Let's put it.
Whatever the request was.
He heard and fulfilled their request. That's what that means. Okay? So you see there's two idioms. These are phrases that the words, an idiom is a phrase, group of words, or a word that refers to something different than what the words literally mean. And so for an example, remember we saw an idiom last week where it talked about the apple of his eye, or the apple of the eye. All right, and that's not a phrase meaning a literal apple in someone's eyeball, but it was a reference to the pupil. All right, so we call that an idiom because it's a phrase that's speaking of something else that's commonly used in the language. Okay, there's also, I see some repetition here. Do you guys see any repetition?
Among. Call.
Call.
How about among?
Among. Okay, good.
Yeah.
In repetition, we could put called and answered. Those are connected ideas.
Yes. Called and
Okay.
answered.
Another repetition might even be these names.
Yes.
They're different people, but they're grouped together. Okay. Okay, so again, there's a lot of figures of speech that we can see in the verse. Let's go to verse 7 and see, is there anything that you guys see here?
He spoke.
What would that be?
Personification.
Idiom.
Well, again, so let's think about this. So you're saying he spoke, or I heard some say idiom. Okay, let's ask ourselves first. The first question we have to ask is, when he says he spoke to them, is that phrase literal? Did God really say something to them? He did, right?
Yes.
They heard a voice from the cloud. So this is referring to something that literally took place. So there's no figure of speech here in describing that. Okay? Now, God doesn't have vocal cords, but in this case, like literal physical vocal cords, but he is able to communicate verbally. You know, people heard him. So when it says he spoke, he literally spoke. You know, to Moses in particular.
So, Pastor Tim, since these are all figurative speech, if that is literal, that means no poetic devices.
Yeah, I think because this is literal, there wouldn't be. Now, if it had said he spoke as a storm in the pillar of cloud, would there be any figure of speech in this statement here?
Simile.
Yes, simile, right? As a storm, because it wasn't a literal storm that he spoke, but it's just describing how he spoke. It was like a storm. Okay? You see the difference? When it just says he spoke in the pillar of cloud, that's a literal event that occurred. The poet is not speaking in a figurative way. But if the poet had said he spoke as a storm in the pillar of the cloud, or his voice thundered, that would be another one. His voice thundered from the cloud. All right? That would also be a figure of speech here, because the addition of this word thundered. All right? So what you need to do is if you're going to identify a figure of speech, you first have to ask yourself, is the statement or the phrase or the words that are used, are they being used here in a literal sense or a figurative sense? Okay, now there's a ultimately literal meaning, like for example, if he had said he spoke as a storm, even though that's figurative language, it still has a literal meaning in the sense of it's describing that, you know, he spoke with great power or you know, it sounded like thunder or something like that. So he's describing a real thing, but the way he's describing it is he's using figurative language. But he's still describing a literal event. There's a literal meaning. But the question is the poet describing that literal event using figurative language? Or is he just describing it using literal language? So he spoke to them in a pillar of cloud is a literal statement. There's no what would I say? Figurative language is the best I can describe that as. Okay, so when you're going to identify figure of speech, you first have to look at the phrase or the words and ask yourself, is this an expression that is not meant literally? Okay, so in that phrase, he spoke to them in the pillar of cloud, we have to say, okay, he spoke to them. Okay, that really happened. That's not a figurative expression. Now, the pillar of cloud, was there a literal pillar of cloud that he spoke from to Moses and Aaron?
Yes.
Yes, there was. So that's literal too. Okay. Now, if we would go back to Exodus and there was never any description of God as a pillar of cloud, you know, then we'd have to say, oh, that maybe this is some figurative expression because there's no evidence of this ever happening. But there is evidence of it happening, so we know it's literal. But sometimes there will be phrases or statements made that didn't literally occur, so then it must be some sort of figurative expression. But in this case, it's literal. Now, the next phrase, they kept his testimonies.
Kept. Idiom.
Okay, kept could be an idiom.
Referring to follow or obey.
Yeah, idiom, kept. Let's follow or obey. All right, so that I think could be a valid idea because the way kept, you know, that's just another way to say they obeyed. So yeah, it's idiomatic because they didn't keep it literally in the sense of, you know, holding it and keeping it, but they kept it in the way of the meaning followed or obeyed. All right.
How about the gave, Pastor Tim?
The what?
Gave, the word in the statutes that he gave. Referring to entrusted or?
Well, did he literally give them commandments? He did, right? Yeah. So that's a literal statement. Now, I see some repetition here again. Do you guys see it?
Testimonies and statute.
Testimonies, statute. Good. Okay.
Then.
All right.
Them, they, them.
Okay, let's go. Yeah, we have them and they, them. The pronouns are repeated. You would catch that later when we do textual observations. All right, let's go to verse 8. Verse 8.
Lord.
Okay, here it is, fellas. Do you see it? Everybody say it with me. Apostrophe. Yes, it's here. Praise God. We found an apostrophe.
The long-awaited one.
Long-awaited. Because again, notice here now, instead of just saying God answered them or you answered them, he says, "Oh Lord our God." So he's speaking directly to God, directly referring to him. And so it's an apostrophe. And again, notice they included the O just as the translators to indicate that direct address. Okay? All right. Well, I gave you that one. But let's see. Where are we at? Emmanuel, do you see any other figures of speech here in verse 8?
So you were forgiving God to them. So that is literal, Pastor Tim.
That is literal. So no figure of speech there. How about you answered them?
That's an idiom.
Remember, we talked about that before.
Idiom.
Yeah, we called it an idiom.
Idiom.
Meaning that God
He heard and granted.
Responded.
God, responded to their prayer. Granted their request. Okay. All right. I think that's
And yet,
captures that. Yeah, an avenger of their evil deeds. I think that's fairly much literal, that he avenged their evil deeds, right?
Yes.
So I would not.
Irony.
Irony?
Forgiving and avenger.
Yeah, those are sort of opposite ideas.
Contrast. Yeah.
They're contrasting, but I don't know that it's ironic in the sense, again, irony is the idea of saying something that
Giving to them and yet avenger of the evil.
Yeah, I think it's just a contrast, saying God both forgave, and avenged. He did both. Okay, I think that's just describing. Now, let's look at verse 9. It's going to be similar to what we saw in verse 5. Brother Will?
Birthday boy.
Is William birthday too?
No.
No, just Ruel. Okay. William, how about, do you want to take it?
Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy hill, for holy is the Lord our God. I would say exalt is I'm confused.
Well, again, look
means
through,
another thing.
look through first and identify, is there anything here that seems figurative, that's not really meant literally? So, for example, worship at his holy hill. What's that a reference to?
It's metonymy. It's a reference of either the temple or Jerusalem.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, let me put this here.
Yeah, it's metonymy.
I think it equals a temple. I don't know if Holy Hill is ever used of Jerusalem as a whole. I have to think about that. I think it's almost always a reference to the Temple Mount. Okay. Do you see any repetition here?
Yeah, exalt and worship.
Exalt, worship. Any other?
Exalt, worship, holy, no.
Holy.
How about holy?
Holy.
Yeah, holy.
Lord.
God,
yeah, Lord our God.
Yeah, Lord our God.
Now, the Lord our God. And again, remember verse 8, we saw Lord our God too, didn't we? So we'll catch that in the next step. Remember before we had this, it seemed like a irony, perhaps, was the worship, or sorry, the exalt.
Exalt and worship, yeah.
Because when you exalt, you lift up, and when you worship, you bow down.
Yeah. That was the same that we talked about back in verse 5.
Verse 5.
Okay. All right. So, see quite a bit. Figure of speech. Actually, every verse had something there, and hopefully you're able to see some of these things. I'll put these notes together for you and give them as a handout, so you can kind of go back, look through them again. Let's turn our attention to, before we go on to other poetic pieces, I want to, we're focused on Hebrew poetry here. Yeah.
Question.
Yes?
So every verses of Hebrew poetry has its figurative language. There is no verse in Hebrew poetry that has no figurative language?
There are verses that would not have figurative language, but it'd be pretty rare. I think typically you should see something, but sometimes it may not be figurative language. It may be another type of poetic device, because technically speaking, and we're going to see that, Lord willing, in a little bit, repetition is not a figure of speech, because it's not figurative, but it is a poetic device. So there are some poetic devices that are not figurative language or figures of speech, but they're used in poetry. I'll just give you a quick list of them now. Repetition is one. Refrain is one, where that's a whole phrase that's repeated like a chorus. Selah is one. That's a particular instruction or poetic device that is used for a pause. What we call elision or ellipsis is one. That is where a phrase is left out that's assumed to be there. Also inclusio. That's where a phrase is repeated to
beginning and
as
end.
a bookend, a beginning and an end of something, a particular psalm or part of a psalm that's intended to be its self-contained. Okay, so these are examples of other types of poetic devices that aren't figures of speech. They're not figurative language, but they are devices used in poetry, okay, to elicit emotion or to focus, have emphasis, things like that. We'll cover that in a few minutes, Lord willing. Before we do that, I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that for Hebrew poetry, we've been focused a lot on all of these things for Hebrew poetry, but we want to remind ourselves there are some examples of Hebrew poetry in the New Testament. So learning these devices isn't just for studying the Psalms. It's not just for studying Old Testament books. Let me show you a few examples where in the New Testament we're going to see elements of these figures of speech. So for example, let me take Mark 9, 43 to 4. Our pastor just taught through these verses a couple of weeks ago at our church. And as we were reading it, I'm seeing, wow, there's a lot of figurative language here and imagery. So what I'm going to have you do is we are now to Kent, again, I think here. Kent, why don't you read this passage and then let me know if you see any imagery or figurative language given here. All right?
Right. And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life crippled than with two hands to go to hell with unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life lame than with 2 feet to be thrown into hell. And if your eyes causes you to sin, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. So the figurative language here is cut off.
Oh, for sure. Not literal.
Lagi mabili na to, ano eh.
Cut it off.
It's not literal.
Hurot kita lang.
Cut it off.
Okay. What would that? What kind of figure of speech would that be? Hyperbole, right?
Yes.
Could this also be an idiom for certain?
An idiom?
Yeah,
well, again, we look at this and we say, does he mean literally to cut it off or gouge it out, right? Tear it out, cut it off. So, okay, I just sinned with my hand. Let me find a knife. Oh, I just looked at something and sinned with my eye. Let me get this pen and gouge it out. I mean, how long would we go, men, before we had no limbs? Right? We'd have to cut out our tongue. We'd have to cut out, right, our feet, our eyes, our ears.
Or
I mean,
mouth.
so I think we understand Jesus didn't literally mean that, but he's using exaggeration to make a point, isn't he? So I would say this is exaggeration, hyperbole, not an idiom necessarily. Though there is an idiomatic phrase, you know, talking about a person being cut off from his people. That's an idiom for to be cast out. But here, I think he's using that term "cut it off" as an exaggeration of you know, do whatever it takes to not sin. All right. Because again, if he meant this literally, then, you know, there would be no Christian alive that would have any part of his body left, hardly, right? So, so again, I think that's hyperbole. Notice too, do you see another poetic device here?
Yes.
Yeah. Causes sin. The word causes.
Causes, what would that, what kind of, does he mean that figuratively or literally?
Poetic device, repetition.
Yeah, repetition. Repetition, right? Causes, he repeats. Another repetition is
Stumble.
cut it off, tear it out.
Tear it out.
Okay.
Stumble.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. Is there any other? Now, when
Quenchable.
what's that?
Quenchable.
Unquenchable? Yeah.
I see sinigduki.
Okay, let me get this first. Quench.
Is the.
Hey, what's that?
Okay. We're getting some, let me see, some static here. Okay.
Is that a building?
Hey, is everybody, my wife's going to take a picture of all of us. Can all of you do your, get on your video for a minute? So we can see all your lovely faces. Wow. Oh, Will's.
Good morning, Pastor Tim.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Oh, you're also beautiful. Okay.
Sige, busy kayo.
Okay. My wife took a picture, so.
Scholar just arrived. The scholar just arrived.
Or closing prayer.
Yeah. Pastor Rex, our Hebrew scholar. You'll have to tell him about the Dr. Barrick website. We spent a lot of time there, brother, so you can, it's a good resource we talked about earlier, so you'll see it in the notes. So at this point, we're just noticing that the New Testament also contains some poetic, some Hebrew poetry. There's something about, what about your hand and your eye and your foot? He says if those cause you to sin. Now, do you find that to be literal? Are you out one day walking and all of a sudden your hand all by itself goes and punches somebody? Is Jesus there speaking literally of just the hand? Does the hand cause us to sin? It's the heart, right? It's my desires, my soul, my spirit. If I, get angry at somebody and then clench my fist and punch them, it wasn't my hand that sinned by itself, but my heart, which used my hand to sin. You see that? So these are all, they're all, I think I would call it metonymy in this sense.
Metonymy?
Because they all represent the heart. You could say synecdoche because they're body parts, but it's not that the hand represents the whole body. He's just talking about the hand as an instrument of the heart or of the soul and spirit. Okay? So again, as we consider figures of speech, we just look at each phrase and ask, is this phrase or group of words literal, or Does it literally mean what it says, or is it mean something else? It's figurative. And so when he says, if your hand causes you to sin, you know, Jesus said elsewhere that it is it's out of the heart, right? The things that are in the heart that cause us to sin. Mark chapter 7, verses 20 and 21, he described how the sins of the body actually come from the heart, from the inner you. So he's not contradicting himself here by saying, oh no, it's your hand's fault or your foot's fault or your eye's fault. It's what's coming from the heart. But he describes it in a poetic way. He says, when your hand causes you to sin,
Amen.
poetic device, meaning it's metonymy, it represents the heart. If your heart, using your hand, causes you to sin, cut it off. Another poetic device, hyperbole. And then he repeats that 3 times
Hyperbole.
for repetition. Okay? Now, also, too, there's a form of, there's some imagery here. What imagery does Jesus use in this statement here?
Quenchable fire.
Yes. What's he describing there?
Picture
Hell.
of
Gehenna.
Yeah, it's a picture of hell,
hell.
and he describes it, though, as an unquenchable fire. Unquenchable fire. He describes it as a place where their worm does not die. That's an image, isn't it? What is that image describing? What is an image of the worm not dying?
There is worm in hell.
Endless.
Yeah, what a worm,
No.
when a person dies,
Endless suffering.
there's endless suffering.
Agony.
Yeah.
It won't end, right? He's saying,
Yeah,
like,
it won't end.
the worm doesn't die, meaning there's always something to feed on. Okay? The fire does not go out because there's always something to burn. It's a very graphic and sober image, isn't it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So he's describing here, describing that hell does not end. Right? And it's this graphic picture of, you know, a worm just never has enough. I mean, it's never runs out of food. And worms are, you know, dead bodies, and they eat away at the dead carcass. But it's a carcass that never gets eaten up. It's a fire that keeps going. It's not quenched because it's never burned everything up. And so that's a picture of those in hell. It will be forever eternal. They will never get burned up fully. They will never be fully destroyed. Okay, but he describes it in a figurative way, or uses imagery in order to convey. It's very different to say hell never ends versus that's a place where the fire is never quenched. That's a more powerful and emotional way to express this idea of eternal punishment. Okay. All right, so these are some examples just from this phrase. There's one more passage I want to take a look at, and we'll probably end with this one here. Luke chapter 1. This is from Mary's Magnificat. Okay, and I want you to notice here, she uses several poetic devices, several aspects of Hebrew poetry here. Yes. All right, so let's have, since Pastor Rex just joined us, brother, we'll have you read these verses here, and then we'll identify some what poetic devices we see. Luke 1.
Luke 1, verse 51 to 53. He has done mighty deeds with his arms. He has scattered those who were proud in the thoughts of their heart. He has brought down rulers from their thrones and has exalted those who were humble. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent away the rich empty-handed.
So any figures of speech or poetic devices you see here?
Yes. Hyperbole.
Okay, where do you see that?
Mighty deeds.
Okay, mighty deeds. So we have to ask, is that statement a literal statement? Has he really done mighty deeds?
Yes.
Yeah, he has. So I wouldn't take that figuratively, but notice he does say mighty deeds with his arm. Now that is a figure of speech. What is that a figure?
Yeah. Metonymy. Sinokdeki.
Mighty deeds with arm. Actually, you could see two.
Hyperbole.
Not hyperbole.
Anthropomorphism.
Anthropomorphism first. Okay,
Yeah.
because God doesn't have an
Anthropomorphism,
arm.
yes.
And I think, Brother Rex, you were saying synecdoche in reference to his arm?
Yeah. Yeah.
Representing
his arm and being himself.
Yeah. Okay, I could see that. So it might be two devices used there. Do we see any repetition here?
Yes.
What repetition?
Hungry, empty-handed.
How about, no, he has. Do you see that? He has. He has. He
Has
has.
exalted, and he has filled.
Has. Okay. So I see a lot of those declarations.
Howard brought down and humbled.
Good. Repetition. Brought down. Humbled. And we even see a connection.
Contrast.
Say again?
Contrast.
Yeah. Yeah, there's almost a parallelism here, right? That's not a poetic device, but it is, or figurative device, but parallelism is used in Hebrew poetry. He's brought down rulers from their thrones, but he's exalted those who were humble. So that's almost a contrasting parallelism, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes,
There are two actually. He has filled the hungry and the rich empty-handed.
Yeah. There's another one.
Contrast.
Contrastive. Parallelism. I see a metonymy here.
That's good thing.
Empty-handed.
When it says, I'll give you a hint, it's in verse 52. Look, there's something there that represents something else.
Rollers.
Thrones. There you go. What is he speaking literally of rulers falling out of their throne?
Yeah.
Or is he talking about something else here?
He's talking about the position.
Yeah, their position, their
their
power.
Influence.
Yeah, their influence.
Their influence. Yeah.
So he's taken them out of their authority, is what he's saying there. So there's not literally, it's a metonymy, meaning the throne there represents their rule, their authority, their position. And so he's saying that God has taken them out of their authority. Okay, that's a metonymy.
Idioms. There's an idiom here.
Okay.
Is it not an idiom, hungry with good things?
How about scattered, brother?
He has filled the hungry with good things.
He's filled the hungry with good things. Okay.
Being
so
hungry is food, but good things are things. Any good things.
Okay, yeah.
An idioms there.
Yeah, I think that's
any good thing.
So for blessing, right?
Yeah, blessings.
Okay. Okay, Brother Ruel, you had another?
Scattered, I think it's an idiom also. He has scattered.
Scattered, yeah. The idea of
I think it's not literal that
yeah, like defeated or humbled or brought down, something like that. Yeah, I think so. So
how about irony? Rich, empty-handed.
Oh, good. Yeah, the rich are made empty-handed. Okay. So you can see even in these New Testament passages, and there are several others, by the way, that figurative language is often used. And in fact, in Mary's Magnificat, as well as in the end of Luke chapter 1, Zacharias, when remember after John is born and he then is allowed to speak, he speaks a poem. So you can see a lot of the elements of Hebrew poetry that he uses there. So in the study of Hebrew poetry, it's not just things that will help us in the Old Testament studies or the Psalms or that kind of thing. It will also help us in some passages in the New Testament. And by the way, not just the Gospels. If you look at Philippians 2 or Colossians 1, I think it's around 1 Timothy 3. I'm not going to get the verses right. I think it's somewhere around there. These are some other examples of poetic expressions. I would say Ephesians 1. Show elements of Hebrew poetry, even though they're New Testament epistles. Okay? So keep that in mind. These things that we're learning to study the Psalms, to study Hebrew poetry, can actually be helpful to you at times in the New Testament books, even the epistles. All right? And you'll see in Revelation as well, in some of the prophetic elements, some poetic expressions, devices. All right? And we'll see figures of speech used all over the place in the Bible. So just keep that in mind. This study is not, just narrowly focused only on the Psalms, but actually we'll see elements of figurative language used everywhere in the Bible, but also even poetic devices and poetic imagery and stuff as well. Okay? So we'll have to wait till next week to go on to our next section here of other poetic devices that are used in Hebrew poetry. Apply those to Psalm 99, and then we'll bring it all together to summarize the theme of the psalm. And then following that, we'll continue on in our other steps. We're going to do structural diagram, textual observations, and word study, some of those things as we march through the exegetical process. Okay? So if there are any final comments or questions that you guys have? Should we end our time by singing happy birthday to Brother Ruel?
Yes, happy
All
birthday.
right. Where are you, brother? Got to see you. Video.
Hiding himself.
Okay, there we go. All right, you guys ready? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Okay, that was pretty bad, but we love you, brother.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank
man.
you so much.
Good to see you again. Have a
See you.
blessed weekend, blessed time of worship. All right. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Bye, God
Bye,
bless.
Pastor Tim. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Pastor
All
Tim.
right. Good
Bye.
afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank
Take care.
you,
Have a
Pastor
good lunch.
Tim. Thank you, everyone.
See you later.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Pastors.